From Software is the GOAT game developer. There, I said it. Just ignore their Wikipedia page. You'll find stuff you didn't want to see. Seriously, what is some of this stuff? Yatsu Hakamura? This game literally has one video on the entirety of YouTube. Granted, I don't know exactly how From Software is structured. In 2024, after countless accolades and Game of the Year efforts, they're hardly the little engine that could anymore. But obviously, different teams develop these games in their more lauded efforts. Still, did you guys know they made a Monster Hunter spin-off? Apparently, this game called Steel Battalion Heavy Armor is literally considered one of the worst video games ever made. Miyazaki even made a VR game called Deracine. Seriously, scroll through a list of games in the From Software library and there's a lot of random crap in there, but I'm obviously being tongue-in-cheek, as amongst that list exists some of the greatest games ever made by arguably the most consistent studio of the last 15 years. And within those games lies a handful of DLCs that reach the pinnacle of game design. With Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree releasing in just a couple of days, sit back and take in what made those adventures so brilliant as we revisit Artorias of the Abyss in Dark Souls 1, the Lost Crowns trilogy of Dark Souls 2, the Ashes of Ariandel and the Ring City in Dark Souls 3, and the Old Hunters of Bloodborne. So, why are we starting with the second DLC installment of the third game in the trilogy? No practical reason, I've just spent the most time in it and frankly like it the best. The Dark Souls 3 DLC, specifically the Ring City, is, as mentioned, the singular area I have spent the most time combating and exploring in a Souls game, and it's not particularly close. Come to think of it, probably in any game. The city is built with layer upon layer of brilliant overlapping terrain and bridges to explore, as well as a PvP hotspot with teams of a host and friendly phantoms essentially trying to traverse from the ringed inner wall bonfire all the way around to Half-Light, enhanced by the ability to reset the fight via the Purging Monument. I really wish From Software allowed resetting of bosses in this manner, especially as only Sekiro has a boss rush mode. For whatever reason, they strayed away from the bonfire aesthetic system in Dark Souls 2. Given the expansive size and length of Elden Ring, this would be a nice quality of life given the trek it would take the average player to get to Malenia, for example, at the beginning of even a new game cycle. And speaking of Half-Light, we'll get him out of the way first because as much fun as I had PvPing towards the end of the Dark Souls 3 cycle, I realize PvPers make up a fraction of the total player base and recognize he's forgettable at best and a complete nuisance on the way to Gale when strictly a PvPer at worst. Your views on Half-Light will be wildly different depending on if you care about PvP and if you fought the NPC or player version and what type of player you fought. I am still sorely disappointed by a number of Elden Ring's PvP choices and balancing, but that's an avenue too expansive and off-topic for this video. Alas, Fia's Cucks, aka Fia's Champions, seem the perfect opportunity for a PvP boss, rather than one of the most hopelessly generic bosses in the entire game. But I digress in returning to the delight that was Half-Light. A boss that mended most of the problems with the old monk in Demon's Souls, most of all having the host spawn in before Half-Light rather than vice versa, while simultaneously protecting the invader with AoE on spawn-in. It's possible this had something to do with connectivity, but I'd like to think it was to prevent Foggate shenanigans, not that I'm above having ever firestormed a fog wall. As well, unless having a specific faith-based build that makes use of casting healing miracles within the Divine Spear fragment, the invader has limited recovery capabilities. It still cracks me up how pissed off this tactic makes people, given the host can heal up to 26 times with Estus, Sigbrows, and the Divine Blessing, which many regulars to Ring City carry on hand. In fairness, taking on a talented Spear of the Church in a solo effort can be quite a daunting task for a casual PvP player. A PvP boss is always going to be a tough balancing act given the vast array of player abilities, personalities, and playstyles, but I think From Software came pretty close with this effort. Offline Half-Light, on the other hand, I mean, he is what he is, a generic stand-in. In returning to the beginning of the DLC, the main thing, of course, any player recalls from the Dreadheap are the Angels of Death, as these guys are an absolute soul-killing nightmare before you figure out how to rid them from the area. From Software intelligently left the first in an easy-to-discover location, whereas the following two, especially the second, take a bit more searching. As well, the Herald Legion Knights provide quite a memorable new enemy type, differing from a standard sword and shield humanoid knight. Their vulnerability to plunge attacks cleverly suits the verticality of the Dreadheap and Ring City. As you make your way through these enemies and the mandatory poison swamp through the ruins of the Shek Village and Winding Old Tree, we come to the Demon Prince. About the best one can fine-tune a duo boss, especially in an arena containing essentially no obstacles. It's really quite an impressive feat. A boss that I infamously ranked as the 15th best boss in Dark Souls 3. I don't even smoke, and I had to have been high when I made that list. This boss is a masterclass of a lesson in how to design a duo boss. A lesson that in similar fashion to Midir, which we'll discuss later, From Software for some reason either forgot or intentionally abandoned in Elden Ring. Contrary to Elden Ring, where Godskin Noble and Godskin Apostle waddle towards you at a similar rate and often occupy the same space, making it extremely difficult for the player to navigate openings of attack, Demon in Pain and Demon from Below use a power system of being fully charged or recovering battery. This allows one demon to pressure the player with melee strikes, while the other can stay at distance and produce ranged attacks, including a brilliant AoE that traces the ground, giving the player ample time to read and react. They really don't have the most comprehensive moveset in Phase 1, but this goes to show starting with a solid design choice makes all the difference. The demons could have 15 visually incredible moves each, but this may have destroyed the balancing of combat. Phase 2, determined by which beast you kill first, will grant the beast a differing special pyromancy. I've always personally opted for killing the demon in pain first, as I find his laser much easier to avoid than the aerial fire orbs. Victory of this fantastic encounter makes passage to the brilliant Ring City. This DLC contains likely the best dragon in the series in Dark Eater Midir, arguably the best duo boss in the series up there with Ornstein and Smough in just defeated Demon Prince, hours of fun for any PvP fan in Half-Light, and lastly highly debated but often cited as the best overall boss in the series in Slave Knight Gale, with apologies to Mr. Ishin. I love you. As with the Dragheap, large parts of the Ring City are fairly linear, where side sections are explorable, but you're generally funneled into a specific direction. The tide may be turning slightly due to the overabundance of open-world games, and maybe it's just that I'm a 90s kid, but I've never held a negative connotation of linearity in games. If designed well, it can be irrelevant whether a game is open or linear. A defining feature of the Ring City is the foreboding presence of Midir, akin to Kalameet and Sin in Dark Souls 1 and 2 respectively. This brilliantly builds tension, as it's always in the back of your mind that you'll be fighting this fantastic beast at some point. Dark Eater Midir excels where the dragons of Elden Ring failed. From Software may be the GOAT boss designer, but sometimes it seems as though they nail how a specific type of boss should be done, and then they completely abandon that idea. Dark Eater Midir is, in a word, perfection, a masterclass in how to design a fight where the foe is substantially larger than the player. I've contested the majestic Dark Beast hundreds of times while trying to PvP in the Ring City, so countering his entire moveset is muscle memory at this point. The obvious obstacle in designing an opponent massively bigger than the player is allowing for the player to get close enough to the enemy for a melee build to attack without the player resorting to simply hacking away at the gargantuan's legs and not being able to see what the opponent is actually doing due to camera proximity. Dark Souls 3 elegantly solves this problem by making Midir's head the focal point of combat. He even has a number of attacks to discourage the player from being underneath him at all. Midir is also perfectly tuned with a variety of melee, projected, and flying attacks that keeps the player on their toes, but not at a blistering pace that prevents the player from reading the situation. Developers should evolve and try new things. This is what has made the Soulsborne series what it is over the years. From Software has never been afraid to try new things. It was all the quirky bosses and ideas they threw at the wall, especially in Demon Souls, now usually relegated to gimmick status, that helped spawn future masterpieces. For some odd reason, From Software decided to completely abandon the design philosophy for dragon bosses in Elden Ring. It's extremely difficult, especially for melee-heavy builds, to attack the foe without getting so lost underneath them you need a map to get out. I'm usually not one for complaining about the camera, but locking onto the head of a dragon in Elden Ring is a recipe for disaster. I'm sure the open world, especially being able to fight on the back of your trusty steed, Torrent, played a large part in the design, and given how expansive the game is, this dragon was copied and pasted countless times all over the map. I'm not entitled enough to think 30 different versions of Midir wandering the lands between is realistic for even the most talented developers, but I am left confused by such a departure from the masterpiece of Midir to the generic reskins that litter the game. Last but not least, Gale is often cited as the GOAT boss of Dark Souls, as he is everything a finale should be. He really makes you stop and think, wow, I just completed the Dark Souls trilogy. That was spectacularly epic. With the ash-covered desert and Anor Londo and Lothric Castle in the distance, the scene set at the end of the world, this is an absolute climax to the series in every way possible. Gale throwing a poor creature with his greatsword is a callback to the Penetrator in Demon Souls, as well as Artorias in Dark Souls. I used to describe Gale as having sporadic attack patterns, but the more I've beaten him over the years, the less I've found this to be true. In my original Dark Souls 3 boss rankings video, I went as far as to compare him to the Orphan of Kos, but these days ways, I've come to find his patterns in Phase 1 quite predictable. However, this can probably be said of almost any boss. Of course, the more you practice, the better your reads will become, the less chaotic a boss will feel. I've been thinking lately that game analysis almost requires two separate scripts, once from the perspective of a first-time, blind playthrough, and once having mastered the game. Now, you won't always take the time to master every game. In fact, this likely will only happen with a handful of your favorites. Anyhow, Gale is just aggressive enough to feel almost overwhelming with a window of recovery time that at first feels slightly too short, but after a handful of attempts, even on a first run, you may begin to no-hit this phase, and that fine-tuning is really where From Software shines and excels. The exhilarating feeling of mastering a boss that once felt insurmountable rather than another game where maybe you mashed enough buttons in rapid succession for, dare I say, a hollow victory. It's been so long since I first came face-to-face with Gale, I don't recall how the contest went, but Phase 2 is arguably easier than Phase 1, given you can roll dodge past most of Gale's attacks, keeping to his side. As long as you don't get stuck in an awkward in-between range to receive bullet hell from his repeating crossbow, Way of White Corona, or even the AoE trail on his cape. The true culmination of all your know-how and powers must be summoned for Phase 3 in order to be keenly aware of the environmental lightning storm, Gale's relentless whirling pressure, and the AoE of skulls reminiscent of Martyr Logarius. His aggressive nature, darkening of the sky, and climax of the soundtrack create a butt-clenching finale, to be sure. The two-part DLC release of Dark Souls 3 began in the form of the Ashes of Ariandel, preceding the more expansive capstone of the Ring City. Admittedly, Ashes of Ariandel is rather brief, but given my love of snow, it's always worth the run. Well, that and Sister Fried and Father Ariandel is a phenomenal encounter, maybe the best three-part contest From Software has ever designed. But we start with an absolutely epic soundtrack and stunning arena that was sadly wasted on one of the most painfully generic bosses From Software has ever unleashed. Granted, I realize in a company like From Software, different people are working on each of these aspects. Sometimes you end up with the engine of a Ferrari and the body of a Ford. I generally err on the side of positivity in my videos, but given the Ashes of Ariandel as two bosses, and this is one of them, I'd imagine that was quite the letdown at the time, especially given Ring City didn't exist yet. Unless you're incapable of finishing a playthrough without fighting every boss like myself, or you're after the champion's bones to duel other players, there's really no point in coming down here. You can discover a hidden Titanite slab, but that's little solace to fight a hopelessly uninspired NPC with 3 random smaller wolves to begin the contest. When a fight is terrible, you can always make it worse by adding multiples of a smaller version of the main boss, a la the Royal Rat Authority in Dark Souls 2. The journey to the Champion's Gravetender in Gravetender Greatwolf is fairly straightforward, with the highlight being the Grand Millwood Knights, one of my personal favorite enemies due to the various weapons they use, including the Millwood Greatbow, their battle axe, ethereal oak shield, and the Quakestone hammer, as well as their attire reminiscent of a past Nordic warrior doing battle in their snow-laden land and capped with an antler helm. The journey down the twisted, tangled tree is unique and maybe an ode to the Great Hollow in Dark Souls, especially the hidden portion that later lands you in Priscilla's arena. The level is essentially predicated on completing a massive lap around the painted world of Ariandel to simply traverse from the first floor of the chapel to the basement to execute the removal of the altar and secret room where you find Father Ariandel. It's a bit of video game goofiness, as you'd expect there'd be some way to get to the basement other than doing a lap around the entire village. Although, given it's supposed to be a secret, maybe that's the point. Anyways, as previously mentioned, it's a journey well worth the effort for one of the most spectacular bosses From Software has ever created. When first crossing this fight, it's a test of endurance more than anything, as it can be quite the challenge to sustain enough Estus for round 3 in what is one of the longer encounters From Software has ever put together. Coming to terms with Sister Fried's quickness and agility in Phase 1 can be difficult, especially if using larger, slower weapons. I don't know if others had the same trouble, but I always had a tough time following her disappearing act until recently. Phase 2 is a test in camera management and keeping an eye on the now more passive Sister Fried while avoiding Father Ariandel's massive frame and frantic thrashing. My playstyle generally involves being locked off and running towards the camera with the duo in the background to avoid taking damage. You knew Phase 2 was coming, given she's the culmination of the Ashes of Ariandel, but most didn't see Phase 3's arrival, given From Software's cruel trick of dropping a Titanite slab after the second phase. If the entire contest is a test in endurance, Phase 3 is a pop quiz on stamina management, as even with the spam-heavy rolling available in Dark Souls 3, Sister Fried's overly aggressive nature puts a dent in this capability, so perhaps a shield proves useful if you take a liking to that style. The beautiful symphony of dark, ice, and melee attacks in unison written with balance tinkered just right to feel unfair while struggling, but make you feel like a god once overcoming, is peak From Software brilliance. In full disclosure, I've only ever played Scholar of the First Sin as far as Dark Souls 2 goes, so what I know of the Lost Crowns trilogy and the Crown of the Sunken King, Crown of the Old Iron King, and Crown of the Ivory King is what is contained in that version of the game. Also, in full disclosure, Dark Souls 2 will likely be the game I have the least comprehensive thoughts on, as I'm no Dark Souls 2 hater by any means, but it's simply the game I've played the least in the series, which, albeit, is still hundreds of hours. As well, given it's been a while since I've intricately explored each area in itself, I'll stick mostly to the bosses in this section. In Crown of the Sunken King, we ventured through the ancient underground city of Shulva, eventually stumbling upon a forgettable NPC boss. Given how atrocious and unmemorable the afflicted grave robber, ancient soldier Varg, and Sarah the old explorer fight was in Dark Souls 2, I'm not sure why Elden Ring rehashed it with possibly an even worse version given the completely flat arena. At least the arena in the Dark Souls 2 version had some intricacy and hide-and-go-seek tactics to play around with. Come to think of it, this arena would actually make for a pretty fun 3v3 PvP map, but throwing generic versions of beloved characters in a room and slapping boss health bars at the bottom, especially in a DLC, generally isn't going to go over well. Honestly, what is the point? I'm the first to argue for different types of bosses, but this really doesn't add anything to the game. With one caveat, while I enjoy listening to lore, I'm by no means an expert, so perhaps there's a meaningful explanation for these three being down here. I will say the idea of 3 lost warriors and explorers being trapped below an ancient city sounds like the beginning of a pretty cool story. Next up is Ilana, who is located on the bottom floor of the Dragon Sanctum and sports a pretty sweet arena given the massive dragon sculpture on the back wall. I'm not gonna lie, her actual aesthetic is pretty downright creepy, but yet so is the general atmosphere down in this creepy dungeon. The gold summons she brings into existence are a nice mechanic, although I would have liked to see a more interesting variety than the skeletons at this point in the game. More in the vein of the massive golden Velstadt, who relentlessly chases you down, definitely a holy crap moment the first time you see it. Between these summons, her ability to cast dark magic as well as teleport, she can be fairly tricky given the array of options and attacks she sends your way. Similar to Nishandra, Ilana was also a fragment of Manus, father of the Abyss, and she represents Wrath. According to her soul item, the Child of Dark accompanies the dragon, slowly amassing souls in anticipation of the coming day of vengeance, perhaps in reference to the conquering of Shulva by Sir Jorg, who defeated the Sunken King, and awakened Sin, who in turn covered Shulva in a toxic cloud. Last up in the Crown of the Sunken King is Sin, the Slumbering Dragon. I love the idea of an Atlantis-like lost civilization, so this entire DLC was right down my alley. The encounters with Sin throughout the level before reaching his fight are an obvious nod to Kalameet from Dark Souls 1. Luckily, from quality standpoint, this fight is much less akin to the Ancient and Guardian Dragons in Dark Souls 2, and more like the aforementioned Kalameet fight. His vast cavernous arena lying deep within Shulva, the Sanctum City, is certainly appropriate for the grand occasion. As well, the heroic soundtrack playing gives the fight a momentous feel. Sin mixes in a nice array of ranged and melee attacks, including his signature fiery poison, certainly some of the coolest and most unique attacks in the game. Boss fights with dragons or large flying creatures are often unbalanced due to them spending too much time out of range, such as the Guardian Dragon contest, but Sin is attuned extremely well. His patterns and flights make sense for the gigantic beast. Sin would probably be a more difficult boss, but due to how far into the game he is, you'll probably be leveled up enough and have enough healing items to tank through and heal whatever he hits you with. To make this encounter more difficult, you'll probably need to impose some sort of healing limits on yourself. However, this is more of a general DS2 issue and less specific to Sin. According to his soul description, the king erected a magnificent city and the dragon slept soundly, until Sir Jorg disturbed it with a single great strike and the dragon could bear its store of poison no longer. The rain of death toppled the city but restored the dragon's purity. An epic encounter and finale to the Crown of the Sunken King. As with the other two DLCs, on approach it is one of the best conceived areas in the game, with the visual of traversing up to and into the depths of a gargantuan forge an awesome idea. Within these areas, the Old Iron King has got to be some of the densest enemy placement in the entire series. This place is crawling with multiple enemies every 5 feet, including the path to the Blue Smelter Demon. I don't know what to make of the Blue Smelter Demon, because on one hand, he's a great boss fight, but on the other, he's a reskin and also has one of the worst run-ups in FromSoft history. He has virtually the same aesthetic, soundtrack, and gameplay as the regular Smelter Demon, which is always going to be a tough sell to players in DLC. The fight is still fun, it's just that you've already seen it in the base game. His blue fiery glow does look pretty sick, I just don't know that changing a color and vaguely altering the moveset constitutes a new boss. I actually think the original Smelter Demon is a pretty underrated boss as a giant flaming beast. He sports a wide variety of attacks with his sword, which he buffs with fire during the fight. He hits very hard, but leaves more than enough windows to allow the player to dodge an attack. Alas, the blow of the reskinned blue Smelter Demon is softened by Peak from Software and the formidably fantastic Fume Knight. Certainly one of the most badass fights in Dark Souls 2. What's cooler than a knight in blacked out armor dual wielding a Fume Ultra Greatsword and a Fume Straight Sword? According to his soul item, Raim was a distinguished knight who became infatuated with the Bride of Ash and settled in this land of smoke and fog. In fact, Raim, along with Velstadt, was one of the king's most trusted figures until he clashed with and was defeated by Velstadt, as corroborated by the rebels' Great Shield and Raim's helm. Actually, if you wear Velstadt's armor into the arena, Fume Knight will immediately buff the Greatsword and go for a heavy attack. Also, don't ask me why I'm buffing with charcoal pine resin for an enemy that would clearly be resistant to fire. Anyhow, Fume Knight presents an awesome fight as his aforementioned dual wielding gives him a large array of attacks on top of some pyromancy spells. Lastly, we come upon Sur Alan. Maybe I'm just blinded by my love of the samurai, but for me, Sur Alan is my favorite boss in Dark Souls 2. Honestly, come to think of it, it can really be any of Fume Knight, Sur Alan, or Burnt Ivory King, which speaks to the quality of the DLC in general. Sur Alan resides in the memory of the old Iron King, meditating, clearing his mind for battle upon the gorgeous marbled floor, eerie yet telling sunset in the back, and epic soundtrack with a touch of finality playing. Sur Alan sports a traditional Eastern armor, yet of his own uniqueness. According to the soul of Sur Alan, he came from an Eastern land and became the king's most trusted knight. Further evidenced by the bewitched Alan sword, when he departed, the old Iron King bequeathed Sur Alan's name to his Iron warriors. Sur Alan will present a unique death animation and commit seppuku if you take no damage in the fight. Unfortunately, I don't have that kind of skill in Dark Souls 2. This fight requires pinpoint precision and timing, as Sur Alan keeps a ton of pressure on you, giving very small windows to make your move. I mentioned I love the snow pretty frequently, but frigid outskirts aside, the Crown of the Ivory King is one of the best areas in the game. Something about the aesthetic of a wintry ice castle is nothing short of magical. The differing pathways, connections, and zones make for some of the best exploration in the game as you track down your teammates to take on the Burnt Ivory King and his soldiers. We start off with Ava, the king's pet, and what a fight this magnificent beast is. Ava, alongside Lud, Zalan, and 4 other beasts, serve the Ivory King, fulfilling specific duties, with Ava's, according to her soul description, being the guardianship of the king's beloved child of dark. The arena on the grand statue-clad bridge with the snow coming through, castle in the background, is something to behold as we do battle with this majestic creature. What's cooler than a giant white tiger with magical powers? The mechanics of the fight aren't anything you haven't seen before. They are pretty typical of a beast encounter of this type, but overall the imagery and conception of aesthetics are what makes this boss memorable. As spectacular as From Software DLC is, you knew this was coming, and as fantastic as they are as developers, Frigid Outskirts is possibly the least fun area I've ever played in a video game. This area had to have been designed to purposely be as obnoxiously irritating as possible, an area in which the player is continuously ambushed by lightning reindeer while having obscured vision due to the snowstorm, complete with no checkpoints, and capped off with a boss reskin. If this was intended to be well designed, it's atrocious. If it was designed as a troll or to be intentionally oppressive, well, that's just plain mean. The area makes sense with the story, but that doesn't make it enjoyable to play. Lastly, we come to the Burnt Ivory King, who is less an individual battle and more a full-scale war, as the first half of the fight is spent brawling waves of charred Lois knights alongside your 3 uncorrupted friends you meet throughout Ilium Lois, which literally sounds like a majestic and magical snow-covered castle. Have I mentioned yet that I love snow-covered lands, especially ones infused with magic? Anyways, this fight sports one of the coolest arenas in any From Software game as we drop down into the depths of hell deep below the snow-covered surface. The lore that goes with it and the grand battle that pursues is pure awesomeness. I wish From Software did these sort of team battles more often, as it's a great change of pace and they're obviously talented enough to pull it off. The Burnt Ivory King has a really badass spin on the traditional knight armor found throughout the game. The soundtrack matches the setting well, and he sports a sweet moveset mechanically, being powerful but fair, sometimes imbuing his sword with magic. I'm not a lore expert by any means, but from what I understand, the flames of chaos surrounding this battle beneath Eliam Lois are the same flames originally created by the Witch of Izalit's attempt to recreate the first flame with the Lord Soul. No idea if that's true, but it sounded really good when I read it. According to his soul description, the proud Ivory King was ever merciful and devoted himself to the protection of his great land until he was devoured by the flames of chaos. So the burnt Ivory King was quite the heroic figure, and this excellent fight does him justice. While having one of the most convoluted DLC entrances imaginable, Artorias of the Abyss is well worth the trouble. I realize a keen player can figure out passage via item descriptions and character dialogue, but I'd imagine the majority of players enter the DLC by way of assistance from Dr. Google. However, after gaining entry, From Software quickly redeemed themselves with a, for the time, quite solid but not overly spectacular boss encounter. I appreciate the active nature of jumping right into combat. Sometimes it's nice to just get the juices flowing early. The Sanctuary Guardian has a mythical aesthetic with AoEs that can be tricky to fully avoid, but his combination of long-range projectile attacks, flying maneuvers, and melee thrashing strike a nice balance in weaving together a nicely balanced array. When I originally played this DLC a few years ago, shockingly I beat each of the 4 Dark Souls DLC bosses on my first or second attempt. Was this indicative of my skill level? Was I a natural for the Dark Souls trilogy? No, not even close, but I did have a maxed out Zweihander and Havel's shield, full Havel's armor substituting Mask of the Mother, and a boatload of health and endurance, which turned out to be pretty overpowered. Albeit, I did fat roll through the entire game, as coming from Bloodborne and being new to this type of game generally, I had no concept of being over-encumbered. In a similar vein, I'm happy most games have done away with item load restrictions. You're already carrying a completely unrealistic amount of crap, and who knows where you're holding these items to begin with. What's the difference if you have one more random item on you? Granted, the number of specific items you have should remain for balancing purposes, but in terms of total item weight, ye hardly knew thee. But I digress as we explore the Royal Woods, which, to be honest, and I'm not sure if this is controversial, but there's not much to it. Granted, the lore building and story is patently obvious, but it's just a daytime version of Darkroot Garden with altered versions of each enemy type. The obvious standout being the Colosseum, the enticing familiar battleground, drawing you ever closer. From Software has always been excellent about providing a little taste of what's to come, whether it be visually seeing your destination in the distance or just this little flyby from Kalameet keeping you engaged. Oh, that's a badass black dragon with red glowing eyes. I can't wait to see that guy again. It gives you a reason to keep progressing and trudging forward. As you eventually draw upon the precipice of the ruined Colosseum to be greeted by an intimidating but awesome running From Software boss scene and Ode to the Penetrator, and repeated later by Slave Knight Gale. If you played Elden Ring or even Dark Souls 3 and then tried to play Dark Souls, I'd imagine by comparison, Artorias probably doesn't stand out as much as From Software has continued to evolve humanoid bosses to a grander and grander scale over the years. While I didn't play Dark Souls until 2019, I did play it first in the trilogy, so I was still able to gather a pretty good idea of his greatness. From Software bosses in general have gotten more difficult over the years as the player base has improved and they continue to evolve and expand their designs. One of the most difficult things in this fight is finding an opening to heal due to the locked animation. I don't know if it's just the restricted feeling of not being able to move or if the animation length of chugging Estus actually is longer, but after putting heavy hours into Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, healing in Dark Souls 1 feels like it takes an eternity. This, along with how rapidly Artorias covers distance with his great length and one-arm reach, makes recovery a difficult task. His one-arm front-flipping attack still is iconic to this day, however, and his trail of purple abyss looks excellent as he jumps and dives around the arena. While he maybe doesn't feel as grand today for newer players, he's still an icon and deserves his recognition as a precursor to much of what From Software has built upon. Upon retrieving the crest key from the Ulasil township and finding Hawkeye Goff back in the Colosseum, we witness one of the coolest scenes in gaming, with the mighty Goff launching his massive gargantuan arrow through the sky to take out the ancient dragon in Kalameet. In a similar vein to Artorias, Kalameet is another that is still spectacular when accounting for the release date, but may not hold up quite as well, especially if you play the newer From Software games first, then return to Dark Souls later to round out the catalog. He's still a fantastic boss, but dragons are no longer novel in these games, especially when in Elden Ring, there's one every 5 feet, and Dark Eater Midir, which all other dragon fights shall forever be judged against, now exists. Nonetheless, a black dragon with glowing red eyes that shoots black and gold fire is about as badass as it gets, and as with Artorias, we must give recognition to precursors who were excellent for their time and laid the foundation for future evolutions. On returning to the Ulasil township and dungeon, we make our way towards Menace, Father of the Abyss. I can't say for sure, as I didn't play when the DLC released in 2012, but given how much his difficulty holds up today, I'd imagine he was considered a near impossible task back then. His legacy has long lived on, as for example, you can see the obvious inspiration in the Demon of Hatred in Sekiro. His arena is arguably the creepiest place in the game, as the pitch-black cave lies at the bottom of the Ulasil Township dungeon, assisted by your faithful companion and Sif, if so fond, during battle with the Father of the Abyss. Noteworthy is his juggling attack, which you'll likely recognize as included in Soul of Cinder's arsenal. His wide array of heavy melee and jumping attacks with differing timings along with devastatingly casted dark spells can be a literal nightmare to deal with. In similar fashion to Dark Souls, the first stanza of the Bloodborne DLC takes place in a reimagined version of an existing level in the Cathedral Ward, now in another dimension or plane version. With Bloodborne being my first venture into the Soulsborne universe, The Old Hunters was my first foray into From Software DLC, so at the time it was exciting to see the blood-drunk hunters stalking and beating up the timid beasts. This is something I wish more games did, as it makes the world feel alive and lived in, especially games where remnants of battles are still taking place. Less of a feeling of the entire world being there specifically for the character to explore, rather a character stumbling upon a lived-in world. It's subtle, but I appreciate this immersion. After exploring the overgrown Cathedral Ward, crossing the Blood Rivers, and defeating the well-executed Old Hunters, we encounter another one of the best bosses in the series, a common occurrence for From Software DLC. The honor of holding the legendary Moonlight Greatsword was bestowed upon none other than Ludwig the Accursed, aka Ludwig the Holy Blade, for the entry of Bloodborne in the long-running tradition of From Software including this legendary weapon in their games. In Phase 1, he's actually a bit spastic. Not Royal Revenant levels of craziness, but he is mostly triggered to do so when in close quarters, while the Royal Revenant is continuously a spastic psychopath. Ludwig's chaotic melee swiping, jolting, and jumping makes sense with the character being in mental decline, and these are mixed in with a ranged spraying attack as well as some jumping off camera that can be conceived as being unfair, having to rely mostly on Jedi Force levels of timing akin to when Luke destroys the Death Star. Phase 2, of course, is where the fight shines, as the marriage of the soundtrack and combat is one of the best I've ever seen, with Ludwig's attack often falling on specific beats of the music and a beautiful symphony of combat. As well, the visual transformation of the thrashing, bucking Bronco, now fully upright with the glorious Holy Moonlight Sword, casting beautiful green rays of arcane magic our way, is simply majestic. Ludwig is peak From Software boss design, especially considering, believe it or not, the fight is now 9 years old. Putting Ludwig out of his misery gives way to the Research Hall, the closest location in Bloodborne to a dungeon. Not a classic version, but maybe a cousin of. Nonetheless, it's one of the best areas From Software has ever designed, especially the exploration and opening of new pathways once pushing the massive crank at the top of the building. The enemies are a bit redundant and don't offer a ton of unique offense, but you wouldn't necessarily want difficult to overcome combatants that would hinder the player's ability for traversal too harshly. Once pulling the aforementioned crank, we eventually find the new opening stairs leading to the Living Failures. They aren't a grand encounter anyone will rank in their top 10 Souls bosses of all time, but the Living Failures are an appetizer for a delicious main course to ease you into the grand finale of the Research Hall before trekking into exploring the secrets of the fishing hamlet. They are the celestial emissary to Ebrietas, or ancient wyvern to nameless king. Greatly discounted is the necessity for a game to ebb and flow, for difficulty to rise and fall, climb, pull back ever so slightly, and peak to a climax. If every boss was Lady Maria, the player would be mentally exhausted 2 hours into the game, likely depleting their mental fortitude to soldier on. While it's not the most inspired design, the aesthetic suits the lore and other enemies of the Research Hall. In a similar vein to Champion's Gravetender and Gravetender Greatwolf, the unique rooftop courtyard arena and phenomenal soundtrack are let down by subpar combat. I'm no musical expert, but the soundtrack sounds like what you would think a cosmic horror soundtrack would sound like. The elegantly violent ballet of Lady Maria as the main event of the Research Hall is an exquisite cap to an excellent level. As with some of the bosses we've discussed today, her difficulty has probably waned over the years and isn't seen as tough today, given a big chunk of the player base has put hundreds of hours into Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and, well, Bloodborne itself. Don't get me wrong, she's still no cakewalk, as the timings of her blood and fire attacks require great patience, timing, and positioning. Phase 1 is probably significantly less difficult than you remember if you haven't played in a long time, as you can continuously dodge past her to avoid the majority of her offense, as well she has decently sized parry windows for those so inclined. As mentioned, the AoEs of the blood and fire ramp up the space and timing difficulty substantially, but are a visual sight to behold as the fight progresses. Lady Maria is a prime example of From Software's exemplary storytelling without saying a word as she transitions through 3 distinct phases. She tries to take you out straight up, can't get you, succumbs to the power of the blood. As her Rikuyo itself reads, she frowned upon blood blades despite being a distant relative of the queen. And in a last gasp attempt to ward off the player from discovering the fishing hamlet, she imbues the blades with the power of fire, demonstrating she'll go to any length to stop you. The fishing hamlet is one of my favorite areas of the game, probably because of how unique the color palette looks and how different the level layout and feel is to the rest of the game. It is also here that lies arguably the most difficult non-boss part of the game and the vaunted double shark fight that even today I don't even bother attempting without a shaman bone blade on hand to turn them on each other. While I'm not covering lore or story in any sort of detail in this video, I should mention the meeting of and repeated combat encounters with Braider, one of the more interesting NPCs in the game, contributes to the tension built in the level. We eventually make our way through countless spear-chucking fishmen, a unique enough enemy, and more of our giant shark friends, all the way down to sea level for the infamous Orphan of Cause. For a developer whose style typically revolves around giving the player ample opportunity to read an attacking animation, bosses that behave in a cerebral manner, the chaotic nature of Orphan of Causes Phase 2 is not for the faint of heart, as even today there's many times I'm legitimately trying to dodge and move at the proper times in this second half, but often don't have total confidence in where either Cause or myself is going. I usually find it's best to match his aggressiveness with my own, as I'm not a no-hit god, taking advantage of the rally mechanic is generally a good option. In going back to Phase 1, it's mostly a test of patience, as staying in his face and trying to fight mano-a-mano as with other enemies of similar size can get you wrecked due to him hitting like a freight train. This has the added benefit of being able to more easily read his projectile and jumping attacks and mitigate some of his frantic sporadic nature. But as mentioned, in Phase 2, all bets are off, especially when he begins summoning lightning from the beachfront. Last but not least, we come to Lawrence. Often maligned as a simple reskin, he provides a more unique encounter than usually given credit for at first glance. I'd argue the aesthetic reskin almost makes Phase 2 all the more surprising and unexpected, as typically you expect a reskin to behave in a manner similar to the original. The frantic nature of his crawling and thrashing as he desperately tries to take you out as his life runs short, spilling and spewing pools of lava all over the arena, creates a tension-filled finale to one of the most difficult bosses in Bloodborne. I'd even argue Phase 1 is better than people give it credit for. It's just the initial letdown of fighting a reskin, even with a tinkered, more devastating moveset. You obviously do have prior knowledge of the Lawrence fight as you come across him quite a ways before battle, especially with many players leaving him until the end of the DLC altogether. You must be much more strategic with Lawrence as opposed to Cleric Beast due to the massive damage. I usually end up resorting to an in-and-out playstyle, staying at range and darting in to avoid being caught in his fight-ending 3-swipe combo. As mentioned, Phase 2 really is the highlight as it provides a completely different spectacle and finale to the encounter. I love the contrast that the phase change happens without a cutscene as opposed to Ludwig's transition, which is one of the most iconic cutscenes in the series. These differing approaches help build the tension in difficult fights and make big moments pop in unique ways. So what does Elden Ring have in store? I've skimmed through a few videos of those lucky enough to have already played, and it sounds like we're looking at anywhere between 20 and 40 hours depending on level of exploration and skill level. I'm thinking this DLC is going to be obviously not as large as the base game, but almost a game unto itself, although nothing tremendously different from what I can tell. Same open world style, with vistas, caves, or catacombs, capped off with a few legacy dungeons, which is entirely fine to me. At this point, the game is what it is, the good and the redundant, although certainly more good. Aside from a handful of gripes, I'll take more Elden Ring over most modern releases any day of the week, and at this point my level of excitement can't actually be charted as I really think we have all-time great DLC ahead in just a few short days. Anyway, I'm happy to have dropped the video again and hope to chat soon. Enjoy the DLC, everyone.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.